Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Anywhere. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, that's something else.
Kristalina's in charge. Thank you all. We'll just give people just a few more seconds to take your seats and settle. It's been a tremendous day. I was here early in the morning, hearing some provocative remarks early in the day by former Vice President Gore. I was privileged to interview Esther Duflo, Nobel laureate in economics, just after that session. And since then, we've just had a terrific diversity of perspectives, helping us understand all the things that are going to be needed to meet this climate crisis. I am honored and privileged to be able to be the moderator of this discussion, which really gets at one of the central issues. Where is the money going to come from to make a truly just, truly international, truly comprehensive transition to the economy that we need? Joining me in this conversation is Prime Minister Davis of the Bahamas. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure being here with you.
Kristalina Georgieva of the I.M.F, Managing Director. And David Malpass, the President of the World Bank. Now, if you look at the headlines any day, you know that the climate crisis is here in earnest. We know that an energy transition and an adaptation transition is urgently needed. And we know that that will take money, specifically lots and lots of money from rich countries to poorer countries that simply are not prepared for the realities of what we are seeing in places like Pakistan, in Puerto Rico. Already, $630 billion of climate finance was deployed just last year, and yet that is not nearly enough. By the World Bank's own calculations, some $90 trillion needs to be deployed in this effort by the year 2030. So we are not on track just yet. Given that World Bank, I'm going to start with you, David. And I want to start about really trying to understand you and your perspective and your leadership of the bank in a more fulsome way. I don't need to tell you, there has been criticism of the bank and your leadership of it over the last several years. In recent months alone, even since the Biden administration has been in power, the UN, the Biden administration itself, development experts, climate experts have all continued to say that the bank is not doing enough. And ever since President Trump appointed you to lead the World Bank, there have been questions about your perspective on the climate science itself. Now, I mentioned Vice President Gore was here earlier today, and I don't know if you heard, but he referred to you in his remarks publicly on stage here as a climate denier. Would you clear the air? Do you accept the scientific consensus that the burning of fossil fuels is dangerously warming the planet? Let's just start there with some level setting.
Okay, that's a odd spot to start, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I was the first invitee, and I'm happy to be here. You know, and I don't know all of the instances that you're talking about. I've been very pleased to have super strong U.S. government support across the board on the initiatives that we've been taking. Some people that are critical, I think, are unfounded. They may not know what the World Bank is doing. Some of them are simply not involved in the efforts that are going on to actually have an impact. People fly to meetings and then make pledges, and then they're gone. And so I really think it might be useful if I just go through what the World Bank is doing. This has been a huge effort for the bank under my leadership. The climate financing from the World Bank has grown rapidly. We're, as you know, by far the biggest funder among the international financial institutions. Add up all the institutions, the I.M.F. and all the other multilateral development banks, and the World Bank is more than all of them put together. What we've done is try to have a logical way to have impact. One thing I've observed is most of what was going on before was talk. And so I'm very happy to have this format, and the reason I came is because you're using the word impact. That's what we launched in the Climate Change Action Plan of the World Bank. That's what I presented at Glasgow. That was very well received by the world community, by the US government, and so on around. So I really want to kind of push back on the premise of that. As far as various initiatives under the Climate Change Action Plan, we're putting together really impressive diagnostics called country climate development reports that are coming out one by one for countries, showing their path to better mitigation and adaptation alternatives. From a financing standpoint, we had a record fiscal year in FY22, $31.7 billion of climate finance by the World Bank Group alone, which is very large within the global context. Half of that is for adaptation, so the bank has been a world leader in focusing attention on resilience, on adaptation and change. We have recent CCDRs out on Sahel, which is really being hit by changes in climate. We are a leader in the methane sprint, methane being one of the most potent of the greenhouse gases. And so we are not only funding the effort, but then putting together the steps that countries can do to address gas flaring, to address land use emissions, and waste, which is one of the big emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And I could go on with a list of all of the various methane projects that the bank has. This is one of the most impactful ways to have traction. But you know, the core you started with is how do we finance all this? And one of and we'll probably talk more about that because that's maybe the purpose of the conference. But the challenge, I think, for the world is to recognize there's a global public good that countries can't finance themselves.
Yes.
And that's where the focus of the World Bank has been, in putting together the stream of funding from the global community into impactful projects in mitigation and adaptation.
Absolutely. I want to talk about all that and more in detail with all our panelists. I also want to give you one more chance to directly address former Vice President Gore's claim that he made on this stage that you were a climate denier. His words.
So very odd. I've never met him. He's not involved in the efforts that we're doing. He may present as a climate person. I don't know what impact that's having.
Okay. Let me just be as clear as I can. Do you accept the scientific consensus that the man-made burning of fossil fuels is rapidly and dangerously warming the planet?
I don't know if everyone wants to comment on that. What we are doing is having impactful projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a mission of a World Bank that's powerful.
Will you answer the question? Is that...
I don't even know. I'm not a scientist, and that is not a question, so Al Gore can put. I don't know why it stays on the stage. What we need to do is move forward with impactful projects.
We're going to move on, but that was about as close to an answer as I believe we're going to get. Kristalina, thank you for being here. The I.M.F., a sister institution to the World Bank, also doing a whole laundry list of things that I'm sure you could talk about. I want to know, though, when you think about exactly where the I.M.F's role is in all of this, some people say that while you can talk a big game from your position at the I.M.F., you're somewhat limited in what you can actually do. So how do you respond to that? Where are the actual levers of change that you can pull?
Try me. So, the I.M.F. today is a systemically significant institution in the fight against climate change. Why? Because climate risks are macrocritical. They undermine macroeconomic and financial stability. And on the flip side, opportunities in the climate transition can boost growth and employment. You're asking me a question. Okay, you talk this talk. What does it mean? It means 4 things that are squarely in the mandate of the I.M.F. 1, we take the pulse of each and every country on a regular basis. It has a technical term. It is called Article 4 consultations. But what it means is that we come like a family doctor every year. Let's see how your policies are performing, how good it is for your people. We are now integrated with an approval, with the support of our board of directors. In this taking the pulse, how are you doing on mitigation, on adaptation, on transition? For countries that are big emitters, of course, we concentrate on a pathway to reduce emissions. For countries that are highly vulnerable, we concentrate on adaptation to climate risks. 2, we, together with the World Bank, produce what is called financial sector assessments. We actually look at the financial systems of each country. We are now integrating climate-related financial stability risks. So when we are looking at the financial sector, we do what the network of greening the banking is doing, stress testing for these risks. 3, data. If we don't make emissions and vulnerability integral in macro data, policymakers, investors, and citizens would not know where are we headed. So we are working on making it so that when I come to see you, we talk about growth, employment, inflation, balance of payment, deficit, and carbon intensity, vulnerability to climate shocks. And 4, we are a financial institution. We have to put money where our mouth is. This October, we are going to launch our Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It would be 40 billion at the start. And what it would do is to support countries in this transition. And I want to make the most important point I would make today, and it is the following. How much money do we have in climate action? You gave the number, 350 billion. How much more we need on an annual basis? 5 to 10 times more. This money, the difference between what is needed and what we are getting, not going to be fixed by our 40 billion, unless this 40 billion is directed to remove barriers for private investment in emerging markets and developing economies on a scale. So I don't want you to hold us accountable for how much money we spent. You have to hold us accountable what is the leverage impact of this money. And so I want to come in 5 years and tell you, leverage impact is at least 1 to 5. And if it is 1 to 10, I would expect you guys to cheer me.
Okay, in fairness, Kristalina, do you believe in the scientific consensus?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Climate change is very clearly a product of our own making.
Thank you for answering the question. Prime Minister, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure being here.
Let me ask the second question first. Do you also believe in the scientific consensus?
I believe in it. I experience it. I see it. As I told leaders at COP26 last year in Glasgow, every day is my yesterday. My yesterday being, I had Dorian, I had Matthew, I had several hurricanes, which has contributed to more than 40% of our debt level. That's why when she comes to me, that's what I point to.
Yep.
So that is what I'm telling them. And today is fast becoming all of our tomorrow.
Okay.
You see the wildfires, the floods. As I sit and speak, one of my islands is now being battered by a tropical storm. Thank God it's only a tropical storm, Fiona, and it's going to skirting. I had to evacuate 30 persons from this island today.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about climate change is no longer a threat, as people still seem to think. It is a crisis, and it has to be addressed, and addressed now,
And
not tomorrow, now.
You now have the opportunity. I know you know David and Kristalina
Yes, I know.
for many years now, but in public, on stage, when you say it has to be addressed now, what is your ask, your plea, not only to the global financial community, but to other developed nations, to the private sector? What do you need now to make your nation more resilient in the years to come so you can withstand these storms, which, as you say, we know are coming?
First of all pledges, all what I call committers, who promise that they're going to make available the monies that they said. For example, in 2015, it's supposed to be $100 billion each year. None of it has been realized to date. We who are most vulnerable are pledge fatigued. We need action, and we need to find ways and means to have the industrialized world, who have been countries who have been burning fossil fuel for centuries, that have this cloud of carbon in the air. We need time for us to let them pay the bill for this now. In fact, I held a UNFCCC conference in my country several weeks ago for the purpose of getting the Caribbean region to be able to speak in one voice. And what's coming out of that we'll take to COP26, for example, is that 2% should be taxed on all oil exports and put into a fund to assist vulnerable countries.
Global oil exports.
Global oil exports.
There's a provocative solution.
That is one we're going to be putting forward. In addition, we think governments can't do it alone. We need a private sector. In my country, I've started a program, well, not started a program, I've set up legislation to engage Article 6 of the Paris Accord to have the private sector engage in the voluntary market, carbon market, by offsetting through purchasing carbon credits. We are now in the process of having our carbon asset verified, and soon, hopefully by the 1st of next year, we'll be on the market selling our carbon credits. For all to know, the Bahamas is one of we don't contribute to the footprint, we don't. But we bear the burden and the risk. And it has been scientifically verified that we are one of the largest carbon sink in the world. And so should we not be paid, even if you want to call us the garbage collectors, because we are collecting your garbage out there.
Yet another provocative solution. I like that. Thank you very much. David, I want to come back and given your response earlier, and I'm not going to ask you to answer the same question again, but given what you said, it makes me wonder how you and the bank think about your approach to climate. If it's not the case that fossil fuel emissions are rapidly and dangerously warming the atmosphere and contributing to extreme weather around the globe, what is the priority? What is the approach? What does it even mean to combat climate change if it is not a rapid transition to a net zero economy? What do you actually mean when you talk about using the bank to support climate efforts?
Right, that was the huge answer that I gave, and I will give it again. The bank is in the forefront of defining projects that will actually have impact. So that's the best question that can be put to everyone. What projects do you want to do in China? What projects in India? What is the diagnostics that record the carbon emissions of various sources around the world? And what's the technique for reducing those, for mitigating the emissions. And that's what our action plan is really aggressive on. And we've challenged and I think brought the global community together on actually doing something about greenhouse gas emissions. That's why I mentioned methane, but it goes to the whole range of programs that we're doing and inventing the diagnostics so that people can understand it. So we need to get past this point of talking about the beliefs and get to the point of talking about the actions that go to having impact. So one of and it's very important, the carbon sink and the question of how are people that are providing global public goods, such as Bahamas does, how can the world community compensate them? And we've been working hard on that in South Africa. One of the challenges is the world community, as you know, at Glasgow, made pledges of we're going to get engaged and really help. And it hasn't come to fruition. The bank has been doing an actual project to close coal-fired power plant in South Africa, but with the regulatory overlay that will make that a lasting contribution to greenhouse gas reduction. We're also on the finance side, and it's very important to think about what the facilities are going to be that allow people to put money into global public goods. And so one that we've looked in detail at various, and the World Bank is a pioneer, 20 years worth of efforts to find, and Kristalina was very involved in this, to find ways to set up trust funds for specific purposes, and we're engaged in that worldwide. And one of the specific purposes is how do you encourage the behavioral changes that are needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in individual countries. There has to be and so we are in the process of setting up a trust fund. So this would be something that the world community can put money into that would then go to countries to compensate or help them afford the global public goods that they're undertaking, whether that's coral reefs, whether that's what we did a very innovative bond in South Africa for protection of black rhinoceroses. The reason that's relevant is because it brought together several techniques to get a global public good, meaning how do you fund people that are taking care of things that are in nature, that are in biodiversity, or that are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Terrific, amazing stuff in there. And I heard you mention a few times reducing emissions, closing coal-fired power plants. Would you say that it is, in your perspective and the bank's perspective, that as a globe, we need to rapidly draw down the use of fossil fuels full stop in order to hasten this transition? Is that one of the bank's priorities?
Absolutely, and you keep coming back to the same kind of approach. What I want to say is that doing that, what you just said, actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is a financial challenge that the world hasn't come up to. You know, you hear all the time the idea about deep carbon credit markets. When you look at the carbon credit markets, they're really small, and so we have pioneered, and I've led the effort to find ways to have verifiable emission reductions that can be attached to projects, because that's the missing step that still doesn't exist. You know, you see a few contracts in the United States where one major bank may buy one hydropower plant, and that allows them to then emit carbon throughout their organization because it's offset by a contracted clean energy source. That doesn't really work for the world in getting greenhouse gas emission reduction. And so I think that step of how do you have verifiable emission reduction is the missing step. And people want to talk about other things, which is fine, but I think we ought to focus on that.
It's a critical point. If we're going to talk it, we got to make sure this is getting done and measured. Kristalina, it was just a couple weeks ago that the I.M.F. extended another roughly $1 billion in short-term emergency debt to Pakistan, even as the rains were falling, even as that country was going to be 1/3 underwater. And as I read that, it made me wonder, are we still using the right playbook? At a moment when Pakistan is experiencing truly catastrophic effects of climate change, that, as the Prime Minister said, is the result not of their own emissions, but of the historical emissions of the developed world, we're asking them to assume more debt. Is it not time to think of new, different ways that we might be able to assist countries, whether it be Pakistan or the Bahamas or any other number of countries that are on the precipice of facing unprecedented climate disasters and not having nearly the financial resources to deal with them? Is more debt really the answer?
So the answer is, of course, we need countries that have caused the problem to meet their obligations. And the 100 billion, I'm actually amazed. We are in 2022. It should have been made available in 2020. We are apparently short 5 billion. How this is possible? But your question is multi-layered. So let me answer the two pieces that I see. The first one is, why is the IMF lending to Pakistan when they're in so much trouble because of climate change? We are lending to Pakistan not because we want to give Pakistan a loan, but because Pakistan needs an IMF program, so other sources of financing, especially grant financing, can come in. We, and that is actually valid for the World Bank, we are designed to be a lender of last resort. And we are like a cooperative. If we were to try to turn our money into grants, to say to Pakistan, you know what, we really care about you, here is a grant, it would be robbing Peter to pay Paul, because it is the cooperative that is providing, by the way, not short-term, this is a normal financing, it's not emergency, it is a program financing. And I do believe that there is a role, because from the position we have, then we can call Saudi Arabia, we can call others. They come with grant financing or highly concessional financing. And actually, we work with the World Bank so they can be more low-cost, long-term financing. Now, this is the first part. The second part of your question is actually very, very serious. What do we do in a world where a crisis upon a crisis upon a crisis has lifted debt burdens on developing countries, and at the same time, they're being hit by climate shocks? And I do believe that it is very important to think about finding a solution that marries these two problems. On one side, debt, on the other side, climate. Yeah. We have been advocating for creating objective platform in which both public institutions, philanthropy, and private sector can step in. And let's take your example. You suck in carbon. Why not provide to your creditors not money, but carbon credits that have monetary equivalent? Is that possible? Yes, it is possible. It is hard, but it is possible. And the bank and the fund, we have been thinking how to create key performance indicators that would allow a country to swap its debt for climate investments in climate resilience or in a mitigation program. And it is important that you guys keep pressure us to find this solution. Not easy, but the World Bank invented carbon trading when the world didn't even have Kyoto Protocol. So that invention, you're absolutely right. But I want to say something that we may miss in this conversation that cannot be missed. We also have to create real incentive for businesses and households to reduce emissions by introducing where it doesn't exist and increasing where it does exist carbon price. Not today, because energy prices are here, and to go and say, oh, now we are going to have a high carbon price, it's not going to work. But we know that energy prices are going to go down eventually. And when they go down, carbon price must step in and go up. Here is the data. Positive, good news. Carbon price globally doubled in the last years. It was $3 a ton, now it is $6 a ton. Bad news, where do we have to be to actually reach the Paris Agreement? We have to be at $75 a ton by 2030.
Right.
So pressure us. Our institutions are really important when it comes down to policies.
Well,
pressure us to bring these policies to countries.
that sounds like an invitation to activism, which I
Yes.
rarely hear. Pretty extraordinary. Prime Minister, we have to hear your response to this. We're talking about the
Debts.
potential for debt relief, perhaps even climate reparations. Can you address your response to this sort of bucket of concerns? How do we get the money moving?
Well, first of all, the multilaterals have to appreciate that the vulnerable countries like ours, they place upon us this, what I call this debt to GDP ratio, debt sustainability, and they have a recommended percentage for that. Most of the vulnerable countries today are far above that. When I took office last year, my debt to GDP ratio was 105%. Fortunately, I brought it down now to about 85%, and it's still going down. So they have to revisit this debt sustainability issue in the context of adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage, particularly when it's as a result of climate change. That's one thing I think they need to do. In framing the question as well, we speak about climate justice, which basically is climate justice and fairness. And perhaps the time has come for us to maybe reframe it, to let these industrialized countries appreciate that, I call it enlightened self-interest. What I mean by that, enlightened self-interest, if we continue on the path that we are, we're saying that we have to contain temperature rise by 1.5% to 2030, and by 2050, we want to go to net zero. Well, if we don't do that, you mentioned the word transition, we're not moving quick enough to get to where we want to be in 2030 or 2050. Well, look at these industrialized countries, think about it. A report says that if climate change and the consequences of it continue the way we are, the world GDP loss will be about 18% within the next, 10, 15 years or more. Think about migration. We become climate refugees. They said that there's about 3.5 billion persons in vulnerable countries. And if they are impacted, as I did at Dorian 3 years ago, we'll become climate refugees. You see what the migration is doing now in Europe. It's impacting the political dynamics in most of these countries. Look what has happened in Central America, over the drought that has hit it over the last several years. The borders of the United States speaks to that. And that too will have impact on the political dynamics here in the United States. So if you don't do anything, your own self-interest ought to be heightened by the fact that these are realities that's going to face you. And you're facing it as we speak. So when these 3.5 billion people have no place to go, because they have lost, the Bahamas is 100,000 square miles of ocean. It's an ocean state. 80% of my land mass is a mere 3 meters above sea level. All right? If nothing happens, if we're lucky, we will be climate refugees. If you're not lucky, we'll be at the mercy of the hurricanes, lose more lives as I did during Dorian, and more people be traumatized, and still as they are today, from having experienced Dorian. And so enlightened self-interest or perhaps to be the way we frame the message going forward. Climate justice and fairness seem to be eluding the industrialized world because they have their own definition for those things.
Wow.
They also have to address the criteria for accessing. Yes, we hear the World Bank. Yes, we hear I.M.F. But we need to address the criteria for accessing these funds. They say I'm a wealthy country, but having had what 5 hurricanes in the last 4 or 5 years, that's ratcheted up my debt
Right.
to beyond a sustainable level. Why would you want to lend me more money to make it more unsustainable for me? As I speak, right, we want to transition to alternative energy. We now recognize that solar panels, and we have a lot of sunshine.
Yeah.
Solar panels, solar energy is now dropped by some 90% since 2009. We also know that it's now cheaper to solarize than to build new fossil infrastructure.
Yep.
So why are we not there? But I'm unable to move as quickly as I would like because I have to be continually funding loss, damage,
And servicing debt.
and servicing debt.
And servicing debt all at the same time.
So the question you raise about putting debts on Pakistan again, is that the answer? And
Yeah.
we need to.
More urgent need for new solutions. We are fast running out of time. I want to try to save a brief couple moments for questions. Think about your questions. We will have mic runners. I'm going to see if I can do just like a 1-minute Q&A with each of you, because I had 10 more pages of questions that I didn't get to. David, I want to start with you. The World Bank's mission is not to address climate change. I fully accept that, okay? How do you balance this tension between rapidly developing economies and trying to raise the standard of living and the quality of life for people who urgently need new incomes, and that's going to take additional energy, with the imperative, which you articulated, to reduce emissions? And help us understand, if you will, very briefly, if somewhere in that tension explains the World Bank's continued financing of fossil fuel projects, which of course is in contrast to what other development banks and countries are doing today.
Right, I want to correct that latter point. I don't think that's correct factually. So the bank was the first in stopping coal funding of coal plants in 2012.
Coal, yes.
The
Gas?
bank has official, and so the bank is not financing upstream gas, but oil, and you know what the reality of the world is that people are burning more and more coal, and coal comes in many varieties, and so they're burning more of the lowest grades coal that makes high carbon intensity and also air pollution. And so the reality of the world is that as the current situation goes on and the trends, the actual performance in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction is going backward, not forward. So we've got to put it in that context. So as far as how the bank is putting that together, the core of our climate change action plan that I have been the strong proponent and drafter of is to integrate climate and development. And that what we have identified is that for many, and I think it's going to be for most countries, there's a good overlap between things that are good for the climate and good for development. The important step and action needed in order to find that overlap is to have diagnostics. That's what we're doing now so we've got a thick report on Vietnam that weds adaptation and mitigation in a way that is favorable to development, meaning rising living standards for the people of Vietnam. And so that's a very practical way, and the world looked at that at Glasgow and said, that's a really good approach to how we can move forward. And my impression is this conference on impact is a perfect example of that.
Thank you. Kristalina, you specifically and the I.M.F. in general have been calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies, very broadly. Would you extend that call to call for an end or a rapider than we're seeing winding down to fossil fuel development and new financing of those projects?
Yes. It is paramount that we change the trajectory and do it fast. Let me say it as clearly as I can. Our research shows that we are half or maximum 2/3 of the emission level that is necessary to reach Paris Agreement by 2030. In other words, we are not on track. And if by 2030 we don't change this trajectory, we are cooked, and not literally. We are cooked. We would be having temperature increase above 2 degrees Celsius. Yeah. Just think what it means, and you described it. So we, as institution, we are doing two things. We are focusing on eliminating harmful subsidies, but we are also focusing on the issue of carbon price, because not pricing carbon is an implicit subsidy. Yeah. We want to see a fair world in which there is a big tent. You can have tax, you can have trade, you even have regulatory equivalency as long as the price goes up. And two, the carbon price is differentiated by level of development. Rich countries, higher price, poor countries, very low. But we all move so we can get this massive risk we are exposing our children and grandchildren to.
Indeed.
Reduced.
Okay. We will see if a year from now we're back talking about a carbon price. Prime Minister, very briefly, because I do want to save time for just one or two audience questions. Yeah. You mentioned you're going to COP with locked arms with other Caribbean nations. What is your ask? What are you going to ask?
First of all, if you would have, I've heard David talk about impact in his lending, and it's directed to mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about reducing carbon emissions. Adaptation is about building resiliently. But what about loss and damage? When something happens, right? How would countries like my country respond to that? And who's going to come to help us when it comes to our loss and our damages? And I think that is something that has to be factored in. I know that is an item that was on the agenda for COP27 coming. The industrialized world is suggesting that we shouldn't talk about it now, but now is the time to talk about it as well. That goes to, in fact, our debts of sustainability, because we spend our money recovering the loss, fixing the damages that's been caused, and that they need to come home with.
A tremendous point. I mean, that must be on the agenda as we all head to Egypt. We have just a few moments for questions. I'll call on the first ones. Introduce yourself very briefly. Ask a very concise, respectful question, please. I saw that hand. Yeah, very quickly.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. As a Puerto Rican, I know it's just a matter of time for the next storm to make landfall. I actually escaped Fiona. And my question is, how can we share the responsibility of guaranteeing equal access to climate capital for countries where we know that the crisis is pushing beyond adaptation? What you just mentioned in the Bahamas, my fellow Caribbean country. I mean, we're spending all of our money in loss and damages, and then the next storm comes what is there to do? Especially if I'm very interested in the perspective of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
I mean,
thank you so much.
Thank you, and maybe this is an opportunity for each of you to address the Prime Minister's point. How are you compensating? How are you thinking about loss and damage?
We're very engaged in that, so we have what's called catastrophe deferred drawdown option loans that countries who are willing to prepare in advance can have assured financing that's very quick, meaning 3-day kind of turnaround. We also have catastrophe bonds. We did one this last year with Jamaica, which is a way of financing and helping with the finance. With Bahamas, we made a major exception in World Bank policy and made a very quick loan after the COVID crisis came out, because Bahamas per capita income is above the normal lending levels, but it's a small island state with an intense vulnerability. So I think there are many finance ways and insurance ways to create some of these products.
And yet the Prime Minister just, I hope I won't betray you here, but he whispered, it's still a debt. It's still debt.
So here is a piece of better news for the Prime Minister. My predecessor, Christine Lagarde, created at the I.M.F. Something called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust.
Yes, yeah.
The purpose is when a country is hit by a disaster of any kind, then this trust would take over payment to the fund instead of the country. When COVID hit, we had about 26 countries benefiting from, in a sense, debt relief that is because of this hit. It is funded by donors, so we are now in a desperate push to replenish it because COVID sucked away all the money we had in it. But the broader concept is correct. And the question is how we can have institutions like ours to create this funding capacity when an innocent bystander is hit by exogenous shock, by external shock, that we can then step forward and make the debt go away so the country can breathe. I am following very closely the discussion on loss and damage. It worries me that it seems to be still in a very early stage, and we are 50 days away from COP27. And it is a very fair ask from countries that are already hit. So again, we have to think how solidarity can flourish in a world in which we so much need each other. And yet we are in a place in world history when there are tensions that make this solidarity stick more difficult. So David and myself, we are going to have our annual meetings in October. Our main preoccupation is keep our membership together. 190 countries, please let's hold hands because we need each other and we would need each other even more.
That is where we are going to leave it. Thank you to all three panelists very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.